Hello everyone, it's me Gerald. Immigration is a hot topic right now within the UK political climate. So I wanted to talk about immigration. Part 1. Political framing and the current situation. Throughout the late 1900s and to the present day, there has always been a party to the right of the Conservatives vilifying immigrants, seeking to lower or even halt immigration entirely to our island nation. Although these parties, such as the BNP and the United Kingdom Independence Party, were always defeated handily at the ballot box, their presence saw a type of victory in the adoption of their policies in mainline parties, most commonly the Conservatives. During the most recent Conservative government, a concession by the Conservative Party led to a referendum on the United Kingdom's continued membership of the European Union, the world's largest fiscal and political union. The EU had been the main scapegoat of UKIP's political rhetoric, with everything from the free movement agreement to the shape of bananas being a source of British ire under the EU's legal purview. The consistent campaigning to leave the EU from UKIP culminated not in their election but in the implementation of their core policy. A vote on the UK's membership of the EU was held in 2016, and with a majority of 51.89%, Leave was announced victorious. This sparked a lengthy leaving process that went on until January 31st of 2020, ending a transition period in which the UK struck a new trade deal with the EU and settled their leaving debts. Acknowledging this political backdrop, I felt it was best to start this video with an accurate assessment of migration within the UK and the EU, drawing comparisons between the two entities. So, did the UK successfully reduce immigration upon leaving the EU? Logically, one might think that this must have happened, but the reality is a little bit more complicated. In 2021, the UK adopted a points-based immigration policy that judged migrants based on their skills, language proficiency, and their familial connections within the UK. The system did not differentiate between EU and non-EU nationals, and only Irish citizens did not have to obtain a visa for work, study or residence within the UK due to a pre-existing common travel agreement. Essentially, EU migrants are treated the same as non-EU migrants before the Brexit process. So what happened? Well, net migration doubled from its EU 2015 number of 333,000 to a peak of 784,000 in 2022. With last year's migration, that of 2024 still being 200,000 migrants greater than that of pre-Brexit numbers. Interestingly, although the UK received fewer migrants in 2024 than in 2022, British citizenship grants increased by 72% from 2022, so we effectively gained more foreign-born British nationals than any other year on record. In 2024, 41% of migrants came to Britain with a work visa, and 34% came to Britain to study with a student visa. On the current point system, all student visas get 2 years in addition to the length of their study, and PhDs enjoy 3 extra years in the UK. Since the introduction of the current student visa, there has been a steep and steady rise in successful applicants extending their visas. The number of international students in the UK increased by 61% between 2017 and 2023, but has dropped by 3.1% in 2024. So before irregular arrivals and asylum seekers are even mentioned in the discussion at all, we have 3 in every 4 migrants accounted for. With the overseas students being a massive source of money for the British economy, paying double the British university fees, we shouldn't really have a problem with them if we're just thinking in cold hard cash. So, work and study visas accounted for, we get to what the British establishment seem to think of as the meat and potatoes of the migration dialogue. The final quarter of immigrants, the irregular movement, small boats and asylum. Small boats have seen a large increase in use since 2018, in which small boats accounted for 2% of all detected unauthorised arrivals, rising to a peak in 2022 where small boats accounted for 84% of said arrivals. 2023 saw a decrease in small boats by 36% due to a cooperation agreement with the Albanian government to return their migrants who have not applied for asylum or those who have been rejected by the British government. This saw the total number of Albanians on small boats decrease by 93%, a fact that suggests that small boat crossings are tractable through agreement with specific source nation governments. This leads me to part 2. What exactly is going on over there? Let's have a look at the most common source countries of refugees in the world. Looking at the most recent years, we have complete data for the top national percentages arriving by small boats are Afghans, Iranians, Syrians, Eritreans, Turks, Sudanese, Vietnamese and Iraqis in that order, with smaller percentages that are non-negligible from the following states: Albania, Egypt, India, Kuwait, Yemen, Ethiopia and Somalia. This accounts for 90% of all crossings between 2023 and 2024. So, let's go nation by nation. What are our chances of a reasonable agreement by nation? Afghanistan throughout 2024 and 2025 has been suffering beneath a Taliban government. Women and girls face gender persecution and all face increased attacks on their freedom of movement and expression. Healthcare is minimal and education for girls beyond primary is outlawed. The Shia Hazara face targeted attacks within the Khorasan province under Islamic State. Women, ethnic and religious minorities are marginalised by political participation, public services and humanitarian assistance. Opponents of the Taliban face arbitrary arrests, disappearances, torture and extrajudicial executions, primarily employees of the previous governments. Human rights advocates, journalists and other critical voices. Media freedom is under attack. Hundreds have been sentenced to death within the media. Many Afghans have been returned to Afghanistan with no regard for their safety. There isn't an agreement possible that would not put the returners at risk of imprisonment or death. Iran. Systemic discrimination and violence is faced by women and girls, the LGBTQI+ communities, ethnic and religious minorities. Women, the Baha'i community, Afghan refugees and other migrants face arbitrary and systematic detention, interrogation, harassment, prosecution, enforced disappearances, torture and the death penalty. The death penalty in particular is used disproportionately with ethnic minorities and migrants, suggesting an ethnic cleansing. International law regarding current and historic crimes against humanity have been ineffectual, with Iranian statesmen appearing completely untouchable. With tensions between the West and Iran going nowhere, there is a very low chance of a reasonable agreement that protects those that we actually send back. The Iranian government also has used recent advances in AI technology to monitor women not wearing their scarves, and have used automated systems to send out fines to make sure that the rules are being adhered to. Syria. In December of 2024, al-Assad was defeated and removed from power following a year of incredible destruction for all Syrians. 6,000 remain detained by autonomous authorities in northeastern Syria. Many across Syria remain without electricity, and more than 2 million have limited access to clean water in northern Syria, a region which Turkey continues to bomb to crush the Kurdish-led Democratic Autonomous Administration. Enforced disappearances and detention are being carried out by the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Syrian National Army, and autonomous authorities including DAANES. There is nowhere truly safe in Syria, and no reputable authority to strike a deal with. No chance. Eritrea. Eritrea is facing issues regarding the right to education, the right to freedom of expression, and forced labour and slavery in the form of mandatory indefinite military service. The Eritrean government has failed to implement suggestions from the UN Commission of Inquiry after international crimes against humanity were detected in 2016 that have been going on since 1991. Additionally, refugees have faced abuses in neighbouring countries. Ethiopia rounded up hundreds of Eritrean refugees and sent them back where they were executed for treason. In Sudan, women and children are victims of sexual abuse and domestic servitude by the Rapid Support Forces, among others. Little to no chance of a reasonable agreement being found that respects the rights of refugees, as merely being a refugee has been used as evidence for treason in the Eritrean state. Probably the worst one. Turkey. Turkey has issues regarding human rights, particularly the freedom to associate and to peacefully assemble. Human rights defenders, journalists, and opposing politicians have all been investigated without reason. Abuse of women and girls remains widespread. Turkey does, on the other hand, have a recent history of keeping refugees, although the threat of unlawful deportation does loom. A bit like here. The possibility of a reasonable deal is greater. However, a promise of legal protections for enemies of the state seems unlikely. Sudan. Following Sudan's civil war, millions have been displaced internally or have sought refuge in neighbouring countries. Egypt has returned hundreds of Sudanese back to their country of origin despite the terrible state that it is in. All parties involved in the conflict have taken part in the widespread looting and destruction of civilian property, sexual violence towards women and girls, and the disregard of social and cultural rights. Sudan has a near total telecommunications blackout, which limits freedom of expression and the ability to deliver humanitarian aid. A workable deal with Sudan in its current state is extremely unlikely. Vietnam. Opponents of the state are severely persecuted in Vietnam, with those found guilty of economic crimes facing the death penalty. The indigenous Montagnard are persecuted and are regularly imprisoned and tortured. The internet is aggressively surveilled to reduce criticisms of the state. Journalists that oppose the state are regularly imprisoned, and there are records of refugees in Thailand being returned to Vietnam through Vietnamese government agents working abroad. Vietnam also has a serious pollution problem that violates the Vietnamese right to a healthy environment, being the second most polluted nation in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Any deal that would protect the politically persecuted seems very unlikely. Iraq. Citizens of Iraq have strict but undefined limitations to their freedom of speech. It is possible for authorities to make arrests over indecent content, which has had no official definition outside of the claim that the content violates public integrity and decency. Security forces have used water cannons, tear gas and live munitions to disperse peaceful protests and sit-ins. Honour is considered a valid excuse for crimes perpetrated against women, including their murder, while corporal punishment in the home is considered legal. There is no will in the Iraqi government to make rape within marriage or domestic violence illegal. There is also no attempt to create domestic violence shelters for women or girls. The Kurdistan regions are bombed on occasion by the Turks. Much of the country suffers water shortages due to unresolved water rights discussions with neighbouring countries. Before the refugees that have made it to the shores of Britain are even considered, there is already a large humanitarian crisis in Iraq for the locally displaced Iraq citizens. Returning Iraqi refugees is just plain illogical with the country in the state that it is. Just out of interest, I checked out Albania's current record on human rights and found that outside of the segregation of those ethnically Roma or Egyptian people, and having issues with mental health hospitals being unsatisfactory, and the persecution of LGBTQI+ people, the nation's human rights issues are quite similar to the UK's, especially with the LGBT thing. They have issues with freedom of expression and poor treatment of refugees. In summary, the nations that account for 77% of all refugees are simply unsuitable for return. Refugees on average are fleeing terrible conditions in their home countries. There is no getting around the fact that the UK has only one civil and moral course of action to take. We, the British, must process our asylum application and give ample opportunity for those of working age to contribute to and integrate into life in the United Kingdom. Or is there another way? Didn't these migrants cross Europe to get to our shores? Aren't most of these small boats immigrants working age men? What is all this talk about abuse towards women and girls when they're not even the subject of our decisions? Could we not say yes only to the female among them? Perhaps we could accuse the French of failing to do their part for their refugees. We can't just acknowledge the humanity of those desperately clawing to our shores, fleeing horrendous conditions, living hand to mouth in fear and sorrow, can we? Personally, I would be more proud to be British if I knew we were a bastion of freedom, international heroism and multiculturalism, but I know the average Brit better than that. So I will continue this investigation by considering methods and opportunities for the British government to shirk responsibility for the condition of its own borders. Part 3. Why is it our problem? Section 1. Get the Europeans to do their part. During the year of 2025, between January and June, the European Mid-Year Review reveals that roughly 399,000 asylum applications occurred across Europe. Over the same time period, the UK experienced roughly 44,000 applications. That number was derived from the year ending June 2025 being halved, as the cumulative number for the year is hard to find with British statistics. This implies that for every asylum application that the UK received, the EU collectively processed 9 asylum applications. The population of the EU is about 450 million, and the UK has a population of about 69.2 million. So for every one Brit, there are 6.5 Europeans. This implies, from a population and economic standpoint, the EU is actually shouldering a greater volume of refugees per capita than the UK. However, the EU is far less dense in terms of population, so one could make an argument that the Europeans have more land to play with when dealing with asylum seekers, so they should shoulder more. Our closest neighbours, France, received the most applications in all of the EU between January and June of 2025, 78,000 applications, followed closely at 77,000 by the Spanish, and Germany at 70,000. The country that received the most applications per person was Greece, at 1 application per 580 Greeks. For comparison, we receive 1 asylum application per 1,575 Brits. If any nation had the right to call for help when dealing with their refugee burden, it would be the Greeks. So, after analysing the situation, we arrive at an uncomfortable truth. The UK actually has a relatively low burden from asylum seekers when compared to its European neighbours. But a question remains, an albeit selfish question, but a question nonetheless. Why are the refugees sheltering in tent and shanty towns in northern France not being processed by the French government? Why are the French not doing anything to stop the small boats from coming to our shores and bothering us with their cries for help? Well, the truth is, the French do try to intervene. Sort of. They are sometimes distracted by their own internal politics and aren't focused on preventing small boat crossings. You must remember that they actually have their own far right that don't want to deal with asylum seekers. So, Farage, Le Pen. However, when they are focused on the issue, it is no mean feat to prevent all crossings. Smugglers use over 150 kilometres of coastline to launch small boat crossings. In addition to this coastline, small boats are often launched from inland canals and remote beaches, often operating during the night. The French police are also under-equipped, under-trained and understaffed to deal with smugglers' operations effectively. The French are also not permitted to intervene in shallow waters to block departures or force vessels back to the coast, as this may endanger lives, which leaves the offending officers open to legal action. They can only intervene to save the lives of people aboard the small boats, nothing more. This leads nicely to the fact that intervening on an overcrowded small boat is dangerous for both rescuer and passenger, leaving them again open to prosecution. Essentially, it is not legal to aggressively intervene in small boat crossings. And once they have left French water, it is perceived as a British issue. There is sometimes posturing from the French of a new maritime doctrine that would allow them to intervene, but this has remained purely a political stance and is today hollow. Indeed, if the French were to act entirely in their own interest, as we often suggest Britain should, they would never stop any refugee from continuing on to another nation. Crossing the Channel in such a fashion is dangerous. As such, to completely evaluate the situation, the motives of the refugees should be considered. France has an acceptance rate which is comparatively low next to the UK's. In 2024, France rejected 62.3% of their asylum applications and granted refugee status only to 21.7%. The UK, in comparison, granted protection to 47% of asylum claims, with 90% of those granted asylum being protected as refugees. Because of this, the UK can be considered a safer bet for refugees seeking stability and a favourable outcome upon arrival. France provides accommodation to all refugees awaiting a decision only during the winter months, leaving 2/3 fending for themselves during the summer months. There is increasing antagonism towards migrants in France as the far right continues to rise, and many migrants have experienced violence from the police. In addition, their tent settlements are routinely destroyed despite adequate housing being denied during most of the year. During these routine destructions, the possessions of asylum seekers are confiscated. Asylum seekers are lied to by smugglers to encourage crossings, as each crossing is carried out at a high price. Asylum seekers from former colonies or those that studied English in their youth can see Britain as more fertile ground to lay down roots and integrate. Even in cases where the asylum seeker has no direct family or friends in the UK. The robust foreign communities in UK cities are well known to those crossing the Channel. Because of this, it is imagined that finding work, communicating with authorities and navigating the asylum system in the UK will be easier than on the continent. The UK shadow economy offers many opportunities for cash-in-hand work for migrants, as the UK economy is less regulated than that of the French. Finally, there is no part of the international refugee law that requires asylum seekers to apply for asylum in their first safe country they arrive in. As such, those who dream of England can continue to England. To penalise those who skip safe countries on their way to the UK or who arrive through irregular means would be against the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, which the UK has not withdrawn from to date. In fact, the UK was instrumental in constructing the UN Refugee Convention, and it was a direct attempt to prevent the repeat of the fate of those displaced by the Nazis. And these people are fleeing comparable institutions. We have racist killings. We have media imprisonment. Just tick, tick, tick. Political enemies, dead. These people are fleeing the Nazis in a different name. This is our cultural inheritance from the silent generation that defeated these people. Some side notes. It is worth mentioning that of the 55,000 migrants claiming asylum in the UK in the first half of 2025, only 20,000 of these migrants arrived by small boat. With an average of 58 people per boat, this is 37% of asylum seekers within the UK. The lion's share of total refugees, but still below 50% of the issue. It is rumoured that asylum seekers receive lavish hotels and large amounts of money. This is not the case. Asylum seekers receive £38 per week in benefits whilst waiting for a decision to be made. The hotels, in truth, are often in disrepair, overcrowded and supplied with low quality food. Those waiting a decision receive comparable or less benefit than they would receive in France. As such, the rumours that we are a soft touch are actually untrue, especially when considering the harassment being normalised outside of refugee hotels. So the UK has its own asylum seeker issues. On a continent populated by countries experiencing asylum seekers in greater numbers with attitudes comparable to the UK's in general. Why aren't they doing their part isn't a fair question. No nation can stop our asylum seekers arriving. One might ask the question, why would they? If refugees were more evenly spread, it is likely that the UK would have even more asylum seekers to deal with. We have it good if the aim is to deal with less asylum seekers. Part 4. Why are they all blokes? of the global refugee population, the balance between men and women is actually roughly 50%. However, those that reach the UK through the use of small boats are made up primarily of working age men, around 78% in 2024. 14% were children, leaving about 10% who are women or other. So, if so many refugees are women, why do we see so few crossing the channel? I have heard people referring to these men as an invasion. I have heard them labelled cowards for leaving their children and their wives behind in war zones. But is this fair? What is the real reason we see a disproportionate number of men within the small boats population? Well, the first thing to point out is that this characteristic of refugees, as mostly male, does not start in Calais. Europe in its entirety is seeing more male refugees than female, although the ratio is more stark in the UK. This is because of intelligent decisions that refugee populations make as they travel, as they make their way to their chosen country of asylum. Some things to consider from the refugee perspective. Travelling is dangerous. Men can handle the trip better than women and children. In Lebanon, the populations of refugee camps are almost entirely women and children, and these are mostly Syrian people. What we are seeing in the UK is a survivorship bias towards males the further they travel from their country of origin. Another saddening truth is the waters of the Mediterranean claim the lives of women and children at a far greater rate. Men are better swimmers, and when they are in the water unconscious or tired, they live longer than women and children do. In a study carried out by Mikael Ellender and Oscar Eriksson, it was shown that out of 15,000 people who died in 18 maritime catastrophes, 17.8% of women survived, whereas 34.5% of men survive. So yes, almost double the rate. A little bit less than double, sorry. Many countries have border patrols and military that will be hostile to the refugee, and if caught, would undermine the efforts of the refugee families. Because of this, families often end up staying in one place that is closer to the nation of origin, that feels safe enough and stable enough. Men, on the other hand, travelling alone, are more able to avoid being captured on their journey and are more able to take necessary risks to go further, possibly send back help or send money. Finally, there are issues with sex trafficking, and the refugee population knows this. Women and children travelling alone are almost certainly at risks of attack, rape, or sex trafficking. Sons are sent ahead instead of daughters for the almost completely obvious reason, from the refugees' perspective, generating the disproportionately male population we receive in Europe and, more starkly, the UK. Part 5. It's a small section. These illegals cost the UK an arm and a leg. While researching, I came across this tweet on Facebook. It was an actual post on Facebook, but it was a tweet. It was a post of a tweet. Anyway, I didn't want to take it at face value because it's not a viable source like this tweet I saw on Facebook. It's not like that. So I went researching, I went looking into the spending on asylum in the most recent budget. And it's almost artificially difficult to pin them down on it. But from what I could piece together, asylum expenditure in 2024, which is factually true, was around 0.24% of the UK's budget in 2025. So from what I can tell, the budget has actually upped the ante when dealing with asylum seekers. This is probably to clear the backlog of asylum claimants in the UK, as well as building alternative asylum housing, which is desperately needed to reduce the cost of asylum seekers within hotels and private landlords. Still, this is very small. This is a very small part of the UK's overall spending. A report from the Commission on the Integration of Refugees found that if asylum seekers were granted the right to work and were supported with English classes and help to work coaches, the overall impact on the economy would be a £1.2 billion surplus. So asylum seekers actually grow the economy, they're not a burden when integrated. If handled correctly, it appears that asylum could cost the UK absolutely nothing. A system of full integration as soon as possible is far superior to the current stalling and delaying which refugees experience. In the grand scheme of things, the asylum process costs the UK very little. Part 6. What is to be done? Ultimately, these human beings do exist, and under international law that the UK still does observe, they have a right to reach the UK and apply for asylum. There are not many options that deny access to the UK available that would not sacrifice our dignity and humanity. We could kill them. Let's just put it out, because this is how the conversation's going. And I find it desperately disappointing and worrying that the conversation around asylum seekers is becoming so drastic when it's a minimal issue for us, and we're talking about thousands of people. But yeah, we could kill them. We could shoot their boats as they're coming in. Kill 15%. That 15%, that's children. That 10%, that's women. And that 78% odd, that is mostly probably innocent men without trial, just for the crime of trying to get to England. Or we could take them all, maybe save the women and the children, and take all the men and put them in detention centres that we won't call concentration camps. We'll call them detention centres, and we'll put razor wire up, and we'll patrol dogs. Yeah, well, that's something we could do. That is something we could do. We could keep them in horrible conditions until they crack and say, actually, just send me home, or just send me somewhere else, because this is worse than what I was fleeing from. Send me back to Lebanon. I'll go back to the refugee camp there. I don't believe that such actions are worth the damage it would do to the UK's reputation on the global stage. Of course I don't. Treating migrants and refugees with contempt and depriving them of their liberty would cement the UK as a problem state, much like Germany was a problem state. We would be following in the footsteps of fascism. Who knows how far the subjugation and systemic bigotry will go. Towards the end, they come after political enemies. They keep chopping us up. You don't like the trans people, you don't like the asylum seekers, well, you don't like the Muslims, and you don't like this, and secretly we don't like the Jews either, and now we don't like lefties, now we don't like the intelligentsia, we don't like academics, and we don't like, and we don't like, and we don't like, and we don't like, we only like white, proper British, white people, And if they don't like what we're doing to the foreigners, then we don't like them as well. That's generally how it goes. We, the British, need to stand on the right side of history. We need to process our migrants, invest in temporary accommodation that is clean and suitable for living, which the British public own, removing the need to pay landlords for private housing. we should invest in English, history and cultural teachers for the refugees that can stay and choose to stay in the UK. We'll help introduce them into the British way of life. The hotel shouting is just harassment. It's criminal. And the flag waving and painting, it just reeks of cultural insecurity. I love the UK. I'm trying to dedicate my life to teaching students, and I've been in the Royal Air Force Air Cadets, you know, guiding the youth within a military organisation, you know, and I just think that's insecurity. Oh, put a flag on every bloody pole and paint the roundabouts with a red cross. Why? Did you forget which country you're in? Refugees very likely believe that Britain is amazing compared to the country that they have fled. The British culture is robust and freedom-loving, and there is no single alien agent that can subvert that. There is no single alien agent that can cause us to fall into despotism, Islamic or otherwise. The only group of people in the UK that can cause our culture, our freedom-loving, multicultural, accepting homeland, the only people that can cause that culture to wither and die and collapse into tyranny, where you're not allowed to be Jewish anymore, you're not allowed to be Hindu anymore, you're not allowed to be Muslim anymore, you're not allowed to be an atheist. Who knows how far it goes? We've got a state religion, remember? You know, what's right, what's wrong? What is British? You know? The only people that can cause our culture to wither and die are the fascists who demand that we all are the same when our strength is our diversity. And fascists wear all different kinds of colours. Purple, deep blue. The pale blues, they like stand next to them and hold their nose. But why on earth are you standing next to them? Now we've got teal ones. And of course we've got the Islamist fascists. They run those countries over there. Yeah, all those countries is run by some form of an Islamic state, pushing everyone around, telling people what to do. They're fascists too. They're just their own kind. And people running away from them are like hoping the British aren't the same. And we're not. We're not. And if Reform win the next election, we'll fight them. Because we have to. And we'll fight their poxy red-tie midwives in the meantime as well. Because that's a joke. Using all the same language. Agreeing with them. Reform are right, don't vote for them. Reform are right, don't vote for them. Idiotic. The Britain I love will do the right thing. But there'll be a Britain they love that will rise to meet mine. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please drop a like and subscribe. I'll try to make one of these once a month. If you hated the video, tell us down in the comments, because you know it will drive up engagement. Probably will never be monetized because I use serious words. But as always, keep it real. Because of that, I'm considering maybe using a Patreon to just like take little tips for anybody who appreciates the fact that I do these videos. I'd like to thank my friend Mark for proofreading this, and I would like to issue one correction from my previous video where I used the term differently abled. This is a political term from 1980s in the United States that is not accepted by the vast majority of the disabled community, and is seen like handy capable. They don't appreciate being called differently abled. The disabled population are disabled. So I will rescind that comment and never use differently abled ever again. Thanks for watching. Keep it real. Cheers.